Sony's 7th generation console, the PlayStation 3, like its predecessors, left a catalog of classics that can't be ignored, and with the lack of backwards compatibility support from the last two generations of consoles, there has really only been one place that lets you experience what this console had to offer outside of owning the actual hardware itself, and that is through RPCS3, a PlayStation 3 emulator. In this basic walkthrough, I'll go over basic requirements, the initial setup, and a few settings that will help you get this very fascinating emulator up and running. So let's get started. So what are you going to need to get this emulator up and running? First, let's start with software requirements. For starters, RPCS3 supports Windows, Linux, and BSD 64-bit operating systems. You will also need to download the PS3 system software, and if you're using Windows, the Visual C++ 2019 redistributable is required. Links to both of these can be found on the official website. Now let's move on to hardware. First and foremost, RPS33 can be run on any 64-bit processor, but that does come with some caveats. Unlike most emulators, the RPS-C3 greatly benefits from multi-core processors. As a bare minimum, it is recommended you use a 4-core 8-threads processor with AVX2 and at least 8 gigabytes of memory and a video card that is OpenGL 4.3 compatible. This recommendation should be able to run some PSN titles, 2D accelerated games, and 3D accelerated games that have a lower polygon count and lower textures. In terms of what is recommended, you'll want at least a 6-core 12-thread with AMD Zen 2, Intel Skylake or higher, 8 gigabytes of memory, and a video card that is Vulkan compatible. This should at least let you run playable titles at their intended frame rate. So now that we've got the requirements out of the way, it's time to go through installation and setup. For this walkthrough, I'll be using the Windows 10 operating system. First, we'll head to the official website rpcs3.net to download the emulator and the system software. I've already downloaded the redistributable, so I won't be doing that for this example. Once you have both files, you'll want to extract the emulator in a preferred file location on your computer. Once the file is unpacked, let's quickly launch RPCS3 by clicking on the rpcs3.exe file. Once it is opened, new folders will appear, so let's go back and review some of them. Dev HDD0 folder is where you will find a few of your games. The games folder is used for PSN games and games that are installed from the emulator, something that I'll be explaining in more detail later on in the video. The first thing that you want to do is install the firmware we downloaded. Clicking on File will give you a drop-down menu where you'll see the option to install the firmware. This will open the file manager where you'll be able to locate the firmware that you downloaded. You'll want to give it some time to install the firmware to the emulator. Once this has completed, you are all set to run games. Now let's add some games. These games can easily be dragged and dropped into the emulator, but for installing games, that's just a little bit different. PSN games and games that can be installed usually carry the PKG extension. To install them, you have to go to the File menu and choose Install Packages/Wraps. You can also use this option for updates and DLC. As you can see, games are listed once they are added. Before you start running games, let's go over settings. Clicking on the config icon will bring up the settings menu, but you'll be more than likely be doing your configurations on a game-by-game basis. To do that, right-click directly over your game of choice and choose Customize Settings. I recommend going to the compatibility section on the RPCS3 website, as recommended settings will be available for your game of choice. The first tab deals with CPU settings. While in most cases no changes need to be made, I did want to point out that depending on the CPU decoder you have selected, certain options may get grayed out. Next, we'll go to the GPU tab. The default renderer is Vulkan. You will almost always get better performance with Vulkan than you will with the other option, OpenGL, but in some cases you actually may need to switch to OpenGL to run certain games. Next, I want to highlight the default resolution. Most games in this period have a 720p resolution, with a few games that run at 1080p. Once you start loading games, the supported resolution does show under the games list. It is recommended you don't go above the supported resolution of your game using this option. Also, depending on the type of graphics card you have, keeping this at 720p may be better for performance on your hardware. On to the next option below it, resolution scale. If you want to upscale or even downscale a game from its original resolution, this is the option you want to use. As you move the slider to your preferred resolution, you will see details on the pixels you are scaling to. The next setting below it, resolution scale threshold, can be used to help fix issues that may come about when you upscale your game. You can often find the recommended settings for this option under the compatibility list on the RPCS3 website. Finally, there is FSR upscaling. This option uses temporal upscaling, which essentially keeps your games at a lower resolution while attempting to mimic a higher resolution, which ultimately helps with performance. That is going to be it for the GPU settings. If you need additional information, you can hover your pointer over each option and the description box below will give you more details. Next, we'll move on to the Advanced tab. There's only one option I want to point out there, and it's the V-blank frequency. If you want to increase the frame rate of your game, then you just need to move the slider forward. If you want to double your frame rate, then you simply need to double the frequency. For example, if you want a game that originally runs at 30 frames per second to run at 60 frames per second, then the frequency needs to be 120 Hz. Bear in mind, some games will require a patch as they are programmed to not go above their original frame rate. Lastly, we will go over the Emulator tab. I recommend enabling the performance overlay to make sure your games are running at the intended frame rate. Enabling both the frame rate and frame time graph is recommended. That is it for settings. Once you are done, make sure you save them. Since I mentioned patches, let's cover that really quickly. RPCS3 makes it easy to find and add patches by going into the Manage menu. Click on Game Patches. A window should pop up asking you if you want to update patches. You can also go to the bottom left and choose the Download Latest Patches option. This will give you a list of available game patches. You can also filter this list with the games that you have by checking the option in the right-hand corner. To make sure these patches work correctly, check the region and the version of your game, as they do have to be the same. Once you find your game, select the kind of patch you want and then choose Apply and Save. Once you're ready to run your game, you can either double-click on it or select it and choose the Start icon on the menu. Remember that when you're running the game for the first time, the emulator has to compile the shader cache, and so you will experience a few hiccups until this completes. While many games are in somewhat of a playable state, only certain titles are actually considered playable. You can confirm this by looking at the compatibility section on your game list. Playable titles means that games can be played from start to finish, while an in-game means that the game will load and you can play it, but you're more than likely going to run into issues like game freezing and unstable frame rates. There are a few titles that can be played online. I've pinned the link to the instructions to the comment section, and the directions are pretty straightforward. You're all set to enjoy this amazing emulator, and I hope you discover some of the wonderful gems from this period in time. For now, this is the Core, your entertainment techie, signing out.